Hello everybody, and welcome to my video. Normally I talk about true crime on this channel, but it's been a while since I've made any of those videos, and I decided to do something with a little bit of a different twist. Today I'll be talking about the horror genre, and more specifically, my criticisms of it. I love horror movies. I've been watching this genre ever since I was a kid, and it pains me to see the modern state of horror. This doesn't only extend to movies, however. Horror literature and horror video games, to a lesser extent, have all been suffering from a litany of problems. Problems that need to be addressed if we are to ever return to the great horror movies of the past. Now I know that horror as a genre is way too vague to pin down. There's slashers, psychological horror, thrillers, and plenty more. But the issues that have been affecting horror movies in the past decade or so extend to all of these genres, either in a small way, such as the decline into mediocrity affecting the thriller genre, or in a massive way, in regards to overall predictability. It is a travesty to watch a horror movie and already know how it's going to end just from the first 10 minutes. Of course, there are a lot of factors that are affecting horror movies, ones that aren't always exclusive to the genre of horror as a whole. But in this video series, I'll be discussing the specific aspects that are pulling it down. Creating a movie isn't easy. I doubt this is a controversial statement, but I feel the need to clarify this before I move on. Writing is difficult, especially when it comes to writing a script. But this is no excuse for a lack of originality. Replaying storylines used in previous movies takes away from the substance of your movie. This can still be done well if you commit to a new spin on an old story, but far too many movies fall into following the same beats because they're perceived as safe, profitable. An example of an overused trope is the hero's sacrifice. It's a story we've all heard before. A great hero gives up their life to stop some sort of evil, leaving the space open to interpret what led to that point, and if this tragedy could be avoided. But this idea has been used far too often when it comes to horror. A prominent example of this is The Shining. In the end, Jack loses his life to the Overlook. In the book, he has a moment of clarity, one last moment where he tries to be the hero, and in the end, he dies while his family survives. It can go back even further, however. In The Exorcist, the story reaches a climax when Karras sacrifices himself to try and stop the demon from hurting anyone else. And since then, countless movies have used self-sacrifice to end the movie in a dramatic way. The father in A Quiet Place, Ellen Ripley in Alien 3, the main character's sacrifice in I Am Legend, David in Evil Dead, Seok Woo in Train to Busan, and pretty recently, the father's sacrifice at the end of Night Swim. That movie is actually what made me want to talk about this trope, because I have a huge issue with it. Sometimes when a talented writer is at the helm, you don't see the sacrifice coming. But horror movies have now made it the standard. You know somebody will usually sacrifice themselves in the movie, and that completely defeats any horror that the movie might have. Either it's the mentor figure, the father figure, or just one of the prominent main characters. You know somebody's bound to die. A horror movie usually has to contain death, but its purpose is to make you feel for the characters, to want them to live. If you go into a movie and know that the predictable character is certainly going to die, then there's no emotional investment. The death is no longer important. It takes away from the emotional climax. Most of the examples I used are pretty good movies, an example of it well done. But for every movie that's good at doing a heroic sacrifice, there's 50 which are boring and identical. And this comes down to a lack of creativity, and it's pretty sad. But self-sacrifice is not the only issue in horror. This lack of creativity runs even deeper, and right into the next trope I have a major issue with. One that has not only seeped into the horror movie genre, but one that has been overused to no end in horror literature. A lot of this section comes down to personal preference. I'm not a fan of gore, at least not in an extreme amount. I can see the appeal that gore has to horror, however. Seeing someone brutally dismembered is definitely going to make you see how much of a threat the enemy is. But there comes a time when shock content goes too far, when it's used as the only factor to drive horror, or when it's placed into a story where it does not belong. This is made much worse when shock horror can logically be avoided. For example, the Saw movies. In these movies, criminals and generally bad people are placed into traps, often needing to hurt or mutilate themselves to escape. This is a pretty interesting concept on its own, but it starts to fall apart the instant you realize how many times the most brutal aspects could be avoided, how many traps could be circumvented, and how often the traps are just unnecessarily cruel. I mean, there's countless YouTube channels debunking every single trap in all of the movies and how to beat them, which are pretty good videos. I'd suggest checking them out. This in the end comes down to writing. I cannot fully blame it on that though. Saw specifically has built its own specific audience, one that enjoys that sort of content. The issue is how often it spills over to other horror movies, scenes which are unnecessarily cruel, especially against people who don't deserve it. Shock factor doesn't only apply to gore, of course, and here's where my problem with a pretty big author comes into play. I've already stated that I have a problem with predictability, and this issue can be even more detrimental to a story when it happens in a book. The biggest culprit in my opinion, of course, is Stephen King. King is a pretty good author for the most part. I know enjoyment of a novel can be subjective to a degree, but objectively, he's quite good at writing. My problem is how predictable the story and driving force of his characters tend to be. If we see a female lead, odds are she has a history of sexual abuse. If we see a child lead, they usually have an abusive parental figure, or both parental figures are abusive. Marriage is an issue too. When we see a married couple, it's either doomed for failure or ruined from the start. I know it's pretty redundant to keep saying this, but predictability is not scary. If you know the basic character archetype from the start, you will know how they face certain situations. The issue here is that characterization is very important. Either a character follows the established morals and beliefs, or they don't, and then the story makes no sense, pushing you away from said character. This isn't an easy standard to meet, but it's certainly possible. And on the topic of Stephen King, he's been using shock as a driving factor in his books for years, to varying effects. Everyone knows of a specific scene from the book It, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Most of his shock factor eventually feels out of place and takes away from the horror that a normal and regular person could face in a story. Shock factor is a pretty big issue in my opinion, but there is one objective issue which can affect any movie across any genre, and that is plot holes. When it comes to storytelling, one of the worst things you can do is break your own world. A plot hole can be the difference between believability and an entire story falling apart. In the horror genre, this is 100 times more catastrophic. True horror relies on being believable. Your villain needs to make sense in the confines of its world. The logic has to exist, otherwise there can be no relatability to the main character. This extends to characterization to an extent. If a character's story or morals have no consistency, then we can't place ourselves in their shoes. We cannot experience the horror from a primary perspective. As the movie industry continues to grow and mutate, plot holes become more and more prevalent. This is for a multitude of reasons, and I think the popularity of movies online and the online discussion is a big one. For any mainstream movie, you'll have 10, 20 videos on YouTube trying to point out its issues, to point out where it went wrong. While this on its own can be a good thing, the reactions of people in the movie industry to criticism is usually hatred and vitriol. People in these big productions cannot take criticism, and thus they do not learn from their mistakes. Further still, there's a growing collective of people siding with the industry, people who consume without a second thought, and are willing to defend objectively bad writing. This, of course, serves to normalize laziness. You can't criticize a plot hole because it's just a movie, which is a dumb fucking argument, but one that's quite common. People don't realize that every world has to be criticized. Every piece of writing has mistakes in some way, and if we do not point out the issues, then the creator of that work will never adapt and grow, and laziness becomes the industry standard. There are many more issues plaguing the movie industry, and the ones I listed plague horror movies in a big way, but they can extend to pretty much any other genre. I wish to point out this lazy writing and offer insight on more specific examples, so if you have any suggestions on what I should cover next, feel free to let me know. I know this is pretty different from my normal kind of video, but I enjoy talking about movies and writing as a whole, so I'm probably going to make more videos like this. I think my next one might be talk about the movies that came out last year, ones I liked and ones I disliked. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!